And this was a boys' brigade expedition for the Queen's Badge. We were going for this. And it started snowing, and we hadn't planned for this. And I just remember soaked wet through, and this blizzard starts with this horizontal hail, and we see this barn in the middle of a field and think, right, we run in there, and we get these soggy, wet jam sandwiches out. We're munching away, and there's all this sheep poo all over the place. What are we doing? And we just all look at each other and just burst out laughing at just this ridiculous situation that we found ourselves in. And I think just that experience of going through something ridiculously challenging, like emotionally, it was really hard. But then just cracking up with some mates and laughing about it was just like, this. There's no going back.
I've been holding back my excitement before we talked off camera here, Rob. I've always wanted to know about Outward Bound. I've heard of Outward Bound my whole life as I got introduced to the outdoors. I've always been kind of curious what Outward Bound as a company and as a brand, what their mission is about. And as I started doing more research into, your mission statement and a little bit about I got excited. So I'm getting ahead of myself already. I often do that. I'll introduce my guest here. This is Dr. Rob Wallis. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Rob Wallis of Outward Bound. What is your position at Outward Bound, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so my position is Principal Education and Curriculum Manager. I've got more into research and evaluation in recent years, so more looking at the impact of that. So I like to say I kind of bookend the courses. I talk about curriculum and make sure that the curriculum we teach in the outdoors is true to Outward Bound curriculum internationally. Then at the other end of the course, I'm looking at, okay, what are the outcomes of that course? What are the students saying they learn on the course? Does that fit with the curriculum that goes in? And then, of course, how does that lead to long-term outcomes and then long-term societal impact? And that gets me more into kind of the support for our work through political means or funders and things like that. So I've kind of got my fingers in many pies in the organization.
Okay. Now, is there like a CEO or something of the company, or is that pretty much you?
No, that's not me. Definitely not me.
Okay.
No, the ED, Executive Director, is Andrew Young.
Okay.
So he's been with us getting on for 10 years, no, over 5 years anyway. And he comes strangely from the diabetes world, which I came from, a researcher in diabetes, but through diabetes camps, and then came to Outward Bound. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Now, tell me a little bit about Outward Bound as a little bit of the history of it, because I know the history, but for people listening to this, they're kind of like, I've never heard of Outward Bound, or they maybe have heard snippets of it. How did Outward Bound get started?
It's 83 years old, so there's a lot of history, but it goes even before that. There were two founders. One was the educational philosopher, who was Kurt Hahn, and then the other part was the financial, and that was Lawrence Holt. Kurt Hahn was an educator from Germany. He was exiled to the UK just before the Second World War due to his vocal views on where he saw Germany going and how the Hitler Youth was building, etc. And so he was exiled to the UK to become headmaster of Gordonstoun School. In the time in Germany, he had a colleague, Marina Ewald, who took students on an expedition. And this is not just like a little field trip. She took them out for 2 months with a vague plan of, okay, we're going to go from Germany, we're going to go up to Finland, we're going to at some points forage for our own food. The students are going to be in control of how they barter for food and how they get their own provisions. And so it was very much the students leading the show, which is very much what Outward Bound's philosophy is like trying to transfer that initiative to students as soon as possible. But when she came back to the school, Hahn saw, not only from her, but in the students as well, the growth in those individuals and how really important that kind of experience was. And so when he founded this school in Gordonston in Scotland, the 28-day Moray badge was a large part of the curriculum, and that still goes on as far as I know up in Gordonston. The school is still running. It's the school where Prince Philip and Prince Charles went as well.
Okay.
So very high end, kind of pretty elitist school, but Hahn was definitely wanted this type of education, not just for the elite, but for the masses, and so developed this Moray badge into a county badge, so a nationwide badge. And the idea was to be funded through the counties. It worked to some extent. Some of the counties, so the equivalent would be ridings in Ontario anyway, the size of those kind of entities in the UK. But funding was always an issue. And then, of course, the Second World War broke out, and obviously funding then became
non-existent.
Yeah. Hahn was still really keen, seeing the development of the war, really keen that these ideas of learning through experience can help the service personnel in the war effort. And he got wind of this guy, Lawrence Holt, who owned the Blue Funnel shipping company running out of Liverpool. Holt was in charge of the merchant ships going to and from the US. So the Atlantic kind of shipping lanes with provisions and munitions as well, coming from the US. And those ships were constantly being torpedoed. And what he was noticing was, like, the old sea personnel were the ones who were surviving. Those with the experience, who'd gone through kind of the rigors of that experience already, were surviving. And the young, fitter individuals were the ones who were succumbing and dying out at sea. So it was looking for some kind of school or training program to put these young service personnel through those kinds of experience, so it wasn't just like throwing them in literally at the deep end, the middle of the Atlantic, without any of these experiences. So he sent an educator, Jim Hogan, up to have this meeting, a 2-hour meeting with Lawrence Holt. It didn't seem to be going well. Like there's a book called Impelled into Experience that Jim Hogan wrote about the whole thing, and he was just leaving the room when Lawrence Holt said, "Hang on, I'll give you £2,000. I've got a house down in Abu Dhabi. You can use that, and you can have some of my teachers from the Navy operations here. But there's two things that I'm going to stipulate. Is, first of all, the first course has to be in 2 months. It's going to start like at the end of the summer, and secondly, the name of it's going to be Outward Bound. And Lawrence Holt was actually the person who said it was going to be Outward Bound. And Kurt Hahn reportedly never liked the name at the start. Historically, in speeches afterwards, came to admit that Outward Bound was one of the best things that built that momentum around. And Outward Bound is a nautical term. There's a Blue Peter flag that means outward bound that ships hoist as they're leaving harbor. And so there's a great metaphor that says, ships are safe at harbor, but that's not what they're built for. And it's that metaphor of students, you're safe under your duvet, you're safe in bed, but that's not really what you're built for. You're built for going out and having experiences, and some are going to be really challenging, some are going to be, really comfortable experiences, but you're going to learn from those challenges. So that's how it got started. So I think July, August 1941.
Okay. Oh, that's fascinating. Okay. It reminds me slightly of the history of the scouting program. It's not the same. That was like 30 years before that is when scouting became a thing. I think that's when Baden-Powell was starting to look at youth and saying, we need to get a program for youth. It was around it was before World War One, I believe.
Yeah, it was the 1900s, like 1907, I think, was the first camp on Brownsea Island. And interestingly, Jim Hogan, who's the guy who had this tricky meeting with Lawrence Holt, he was a scout leader. He had noticed that then, as in now as well, there's that attrition from, there's a lot of kids in Cubs, and then it gets a few less in Scouts, which is a bit older, like 14 to 17. And then after 17 years, it really drops off. When you've got rovers and venturers. And his thought was, this Outward Bound program would be perfect for that age group. And that's really a good age group that we We come in like the late school, early university kind of age
Okay.
group. We focus more on the social emotional learning, social competence, and emotional intelligence, and use the outdoors as a vehicle for that. But at younger ages, it's harder to go as deep. So with our older participants, then we can really kind of delve into those emotional strategies, dealing with failure, dealing with conflict, and all those kinds of things that the outdoors really brings out.
I'm excited for where this conversation is going to go, because this is my jam. This is like my favorite thing to talk about is, how to help youth find meaning in their lives and connection to the outdoors. I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and I'm going to put you a bit on the spot. I told you I was going to do this earlier, but I'll do it anyway. I think everyone has some version of a conversion story to the outdoors. More importantly, people who are involved in outdoor programming or in any kind of occupation that puts them in the outdoors, they seem to always have a story, or they just grew up with it and they've never known anything differently. I'm curious, from your perspective, what's your story? What's your conversion story?
So my history is in the Boys Brigade. So the Boys Brigade was forerunner to Scouts even, so 1883 now. And Baden-Powell was in the Boys Brigade and decided to focus on those camping aspects of the activities that we did. And so I'm going to take that and I'm going to run with it. That's how Scouts was developed. But my family was always involved with the Boys Brigade. And as well, I was not very fit at all when I was a kid, like not into organized sports. And I do remember a teacher so I used to cycle to school, which wasn't very far, but there was a hill called Spen Lane. And I used to get off at the bottom of the hill and just walk my bike up. And there was a teacher, Mr. London, who he drove to school, which I never actually questioned. But anyway, he drove to school. But every day he would say, "Oh, so you get," even if I hadn't, I knew I hadn't got a little bit further up the hill, but he'd tell me, "I saw you get a little bit further up the hill there," and it really gave me that incentive to try a little bit harder. And I would say, my watershed moment was the day I got up to the top of that hill without having to get off. That was it. I was away and was like I could cycle up that hill all the way to school. So I remember that, and and that was like a significant person who influenced me, because I feel like I then started to enjoy more of those outdoor activities because I was able to be a little bit more active. And when I was 14, we went on a youth hosteling expedition. In fact, I know the date. It was the 22nd of March, so it must have been 1985. What were you doing then?
I was in grade 5.
Right. So I was with two of my mates, Ian Benson and Ian Sheldrake, and this was a Boys Brigade expedition for the Queen's Badge. We were going for this, and it started snowing, and we hadn't planned for this. It wasn't supposed to snow in March. It was like near Easter, and I just remember, like, we're pretty miserable. We were soaked wet through, and this blizzard starts with this horizontal hail, and we see this barn in the middle of a field and think, right, we run in there, and we get these soggy, wet jam sandwiches out, and we're munching away, and there's all this sheep poo all over the place, and my mate Ian Benson's like miserable as anything, just like, oh, what are we doing? And we just all look at each other and just burst out laughing at just this ridiculous situation that we found ourselves in. And I think just that experience of going through something ridiculously challenging, like emotionally, it was really hard. But then just cracking up with some mates and laughing about it was just like, this. There's no going back. I don't know why, but it was just really, really impactful. And yeah, I didn't come to it as a career until much, much later, but always as a hobby or as an interest. It's always been something that I've really liked.
If I was to put money on a certain concept or an idea, it's that people who make that conversion to the outdoors, it often is that age group. It's about that time, from that like 13, 14 up to 17 age, if it happens then, it's there and it's solid, and it never goes away.
Mhm.
So yeah, my own story, I'll be sharing it on a future podcast. I'm going to sit down with my dad, because my dad's a part of that story, but it's essentially very similar in the sharing that experience with other people, and feeling that weight of, like, this is hard, but it's so great to be with great people. And so I want to get into the mission of Outward Bound, because this, I find this fascinating. I've got it written on my board here. It says to cultivate resilience, leadership, connections, and compassion through inspiring and challenging journeys of discovery in the natural world. That's the first part of it. Then the vision, this is the part that caught my attention, is for a healthy, resilient society formed through lasting connections to self, others, and the natural world. That phrase, that, a resilient society and connections to the natural world, that to me is like, wow, that jumps off the page for me. To me, that's so important in my own life, and my, the lives of people that I associate with. When I say that mission out loud, like, a little bit, can you talk a little bit about that mission, or how Outward Bound accomplishes that mission?
I mean, it talks about the transferring that experience from the course to wider society. So building a resilient society in that vision. And one of the problems we have with talking about Outward Bound is there are so many benefits to what we do, whether that's mental health, or whether that's physical health, whether that's connection to the environment, whether that's disconnecting from technology. The list goes on of how many different benefits there are, and so trying to hone that down, like building resilience in any way, shape, or form, is really what we're good at. And then connecting to self, others, and the natural world, that's what we keep coming back to whenever we try and change our mission, or looking at our outcomes. It's always like self, others, and the natural world are the three things that really, I mean, it encompasses everything, which I guess is a bit of a cheat, but it really is talking about building resilience, building social competence, and building environmental responsibilities, where that curriculum kind of focuses on.
And I'm assuming that this has developed over time. It wasn't like right out of the gate. That's what Outward Bound was focused on specifically, or has that not changed over time?
It's interesting because I mean, when Kurt Hahn started Outward Bound, he started with 4 pillars, and they were more kind of functional aspects. So building physical fitness, self-reliance, compassion through service, and then mastery through craftsmanship. So really looking at what are those kind of skills that we're building on a course. Whereas I think our mission, and the mission to cultivate, resilience, compassion, leadership, connections, those 4 things are more kind of the outcomes. So it has kind of changed over time, and organizations do go through strategic planning processes and things, and we've evolved as well. So currently we are, when I started Outward Bound. So I started in 2011, and since then up to now, like, that mission has been central, and it's a really good kind of guiding light of, okay, we've got this possibility to run a program with this adult group or some group, and the first question is it mission aligned? Or we might have workshops that we might be developing on a certain platform, whether that's in a classroom. It's like, okay, does it connect with the mission? Is it in the natural world? It's been a really good guiding light of a test, the mission test. Okay. Does this program fit with our mission? But we have evolved, and I think we've become even more of a leader. You said you'd heard of Outward Bound for many years, but we've kind of taken it on ourselves to be responsible for using that influence to be a vocal champion for outdoor education in general. And there are a number of great organizations that are really good at shouting out loud about the benefits of outdoor education. Like Take Me Outside is a huge organization that's gaining a lot of momentum, for example. There's Nature for All that's building connections between lots of not-for-profits. That
I'm gonna write that one down.
So there's lots of organizations, and what we're trying to look at is specifically at outdoor education. The difficulty with outdoor education is, as I mentioned, there's so many different benefits, educational benefits as well. There's so many that it's hard to articulate exactly what we do. And experiential education as well, as far as curriculum goes, it's not like between 10 and 11 we're going to do math, and then between 11 and 12 we're going to do English. It depends on the situation that's presented in front of you, whether that's the weather throwing something at you, whether it's your friends throwing something at you. There's always situations that you need to work through. So there's no, there's models and there's pedagogy behind it. But as far as curriculum, it's a little bit more flexible than a traditional classroom. So one of the issues is articulating that, and articulating the power and the benefits of that to educational leaders. The downside of it as well is that it's incredibly expensive. So what my task is, or part of my task, is to really highlight the value that there really is value for that expense. And I see outdoor education and particularly like immersive expeditions in nature, the type that Outward Bound does, it's really a fast track way of learning those social emotional skills. Like, it's putting you into unfamiliar situations with unfamiliar people most of the time to work through all those social skills and those emotional skills that you need to succeed, whether that's at school or with family or in your communities. Even though, our courses are like 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes, it's still such value for money time-wise as well, because it's a fast-track way of learning those skills. However, when you look at outdoor education across the public school system, it's usually one of the first things that gets cut, because it is expensive, and it's an easy budget line to say, okay, if we just close that center, then we're saving this amount of money. So what we're trying to do at Outward Bound is really shout about those positives, shout about what is the value, the true value. And we were able to work through my work looking at that mission test and looking at the outcomes. We were able to work with Bain and Company, who gave, as part of their corporate social responsibility, they did a social return on investment study that showed that $1 donated to Outward Bound is a value of $13 back to society, whether that's through saved workplace days, through less illness, whether that's mental health or whether that's through physical health, or whether that's through tax dollars, through people getting more leadership, managerial jobs. So that's been really useful in really trying to tell our story of it looks expensive. It is expensive, but the value that you get back is so much worth it.
So this brings up another question then I had. I didn't even write this one down, but this is one that I've always thought Outward Bound was, or at least maybe it started this way, or it was when I was younger, that it was a camp for troubled youth. That this was for people who, were on the edge of, whatever they were at in society, that somehow they were sponsored in some way to go to the camp. And then that the goal was rehabilitation and, like you say, character education and that sort of thing. That was my understanding of it when I was younger. I've learned since then that that's not it. But is there any truth to that? Was that?
Yeah. I think generally if a kid is succeeding at school, then the parents aren't looking for alternative programs, to send the kid. Okay, kid's really happy doing well in school, and so that's status quo is fine. And when a kid is struggling, then parents start looking for other programs. I think that's the case. I mean, this type of education, I believe, is that it's not for. I mean, a 32-day whitewater trip up the Mississippi River is not for everybody, 100%. But we do have shorter trips. We have more accessible courses we have down at the Brickworks in Toronto. We have day programs, but trying to build a relationship with schools that it's multi-day over a period of time, more accessible. There are benefits to everybody. I think, how did you put it, for troubled teens or at-risk youth, it's one of the first kind of things that parents might look at to benefit their child. And I think certainly when Outward Bound started, so it started in Canada in 1969, and just talking to some of the alumni from then, it was kind of, my parents sent me there to fix me, kind of thing. And a lot of the people that we still hear from, it definitely worked, and it completely changed the trajectory of their life. I'm sure there were many that that you have to be motivated, you have to be bought into the program to get the best out of it. So I'm sure there were quite a few that didn't happen.
Yeah. And I bet you there's people, just like you're saying, where the parents have put them in the program and they don't want to be there.
Yeah. And we still have that to some extent. We have a very in-depth admissions process, and that's just to make sure the right person is on the right course. And through that process, it's quite easy to tell whether it's the individual, the participant who's kind of filled out the answers to the questions, or whether it's the parent. And we'll have phone conversations, and we'll talk to the youth to really find out, is this a good fit, or is there a different course that maybe is not quite as extreme as the one you're looking at, that might be more appropriate for you. And we're just trying to get the right person on the right course.
Yeah. To me, it's the whole concept of taking at-risk youth, or just youth in general, in the outdoors is so rewarding for me. And it's mostly because I feel like when I go in the outdoors, there's not much I have to do. I mean, there are things you do have to do, but nature takes care of a lot of the things for you. So there's rules, obviously, that you don't follow those rules, and nature will slap them back into place. And there's natural consequences for things that just don't exist in a classroom, in a with four walls. I guess what I'm just tapping into my own philosophy here, which is that nature is the ultimate teacher. Nature can teach us just about anything if we're open to it, and of course if we start to learn a little bit about if we start establishing a connection to it. Yeah, maybe just tell a little bit of, if you've got any good stories of, and you don't have to use names or anything, but like an experience or a thing that you've watched where a individual or individuals have had an impacting experience through Outward Bound.
I just came back from some meetings I had over in Kelowna.
Oh, yeah.
And we ran a program with a school, and it's through the Center for Global Education, and the College Board have an AP seminar program focused on nature education. And they got some funding to run a pilot program. And so we worked with the Okanagan school district over there, and I got to meet the students. And I rarely get to meet students a long time after a course. Like with my evaluation tool, we see them immediately after the course. I have some alumni evaluation tools that go out online, but I rarely sit down with students. And the teacher told me beforehand how enthusiastic, and so this was, they went on the course in September, and this was a couple of weeks ago, so 6 months, let's say, after. She was so excited to introduce me to them. And I was kind of, I've met students before. I know that it's impactful. I know people are really enthusiastic about when they come back from an Outward Bound course. But the thing that really struck me was, this is 6 months after the course, and the things that they were saying about how it affected their community in the school was really important for me, in that there were people on that, we call them brigades, in the 8 people that they were on course with. There were people that when they saw they were in the same group were maybe a little bit kind of like, I wish I was with so and so instead.
From the same school.
From the same school, but,
gotcha.
but people that they wouldn't mix with at all. But they saw a different side to them, and they saw some really positive things that and made some really positive connections. And it built that whole class as a community. So there's like 20 people in the class,
Mm-hmm.
and even though they were in different brigades, they'd been through the same experience as well, and so they were able to bond.
Mm.
And as far as the projects goes, like on the course, they learn how to make goals, how to make sure you're on track with those goals, how to get the best out of each other, how to get the best out of yourself. And the way that impacted their schoolwork, their school life was really huge. And I had never really witnessed that until meeting these students in Kelowna. So just, and when we talk to, like, for example, Bain and Company, and when we talk to external evaluators on the outcomes of our programs, they're saying, well, you know, we need to do an analysis on alumni because we need to work out what the drop-off is of what the impact is. And what we found with Outward Bound programs is it's the opposite, is that impact actually increases over time. Because when as soon as you come off a course, you don't actually realize how impactful that has been. And then later on in life, you're really using the tools, the skills, the competencies that you learned on course to really help your school life, your career, your community after the fact.
Oh yeah, I'll bet whoever attends these kinds of programs, they're going to be, years, decades afterwards. It's going to be something that impacted them, for the rest of their life, like you say. So maybe this gets into this next topic. I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the kinds of barriers? We talked a little bit about the financial barrier. Obviously, that's a barrier, and maybe we can come back to that one later. I'm curious about. I have a question about that, but specifically, what are some barriers you see young people face, or just adults in general face, when it comes to connection with the outdoors? What are those barriers?
In the short term, they're very kind of tangible barriers. And again, coming back to the students at George Eliot School that I met the other week, hygiene was a significant anxiety point of, we're used to showering every day and keeping everything pretty sterile. And so, anxiety over, where am I going to shower? What am I going to eat? Where am I going to poo? Is usually one of the first topics that we get out of the way, and just like, okay. And in our different regions, there are different places. Bugs are quite a significant anxiety point and barrier to quite a few students in coming on expedition and any kind of wildlife encounter. So we try and alleviate those. So those are kind of tangible things that, we've seen a huge increase in anxiety levels in general, and they come out in those particular topics. I mean, especially since the pandemic as well, the issues that we see, the incidents that we see, are much more related to mental health than they were pre-pandemic, and even before the pandemic, it was on the rise. And that's one of the things that an Outward Bound course, outdoor education, connection to nature can really help with. The outdoor industry is very monochrome. It's people who look like you and me, and so with Canada, and particularly in the area I live in, eastern Toronto, there's a lot of new immigrants who have a different relationship with the outdoors. And what we find sometimes is some of the youth that come on our trips, they have to persuade their parents that this is a good thing. Like the youth,
it's the other way around.
The youth can they feel pretty comfortable sleeping in a tent, and the parents are thinking, well, hang on, why would you sleep in a tent? Like I've spent half my life trying to get away from that kind of living environment, and now we've got a comfortable life in Toronto. Why would I ever do that?
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of that as a barrier, but that's a strange barrier that I hadn't even considered. That's a barrier for that parents. There's this generation gap of people that haven't really spent a whole lot of time in the outdoors, or that and various, like you say, various cultures have different approaches to this, but there's an entire generation that have that experience of why it's even important in the first place. And I hadn't even considered it as that's a potential area. Maybe you'll get to this, but I'm curious how you would target that.
As I mentioned, the outdoor sector currently suffers from a lack of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to survive and in order to thrive, we need to address that. We need to improve access and welcoming to the outdoors for people of color, for new immigrants, and without. In Outward Bound Canada, we've managed to get a grant from the federal government, ostensibly as a recovery measure from the pandemic, as we saw the number of staff that we have available being decimated from people retraining, and across the board with camps as well. It's really hard to regain that continuity of instructors that we had before, because everybody overnight experiences in the outdoors were the first thing to shut down and the last thing to come back with the pandemic. So we managed to get a grant to create the Outward Bound Training Academy for Outdoor Professionals, and use that as an opportunity to really focus on, okay, we need to think differently about this, and we need to welcome people who have been underrepresented in the instructor pool that and the management and the director, the executive director of organizations pool that we have. And so we've exceeded our targets that we set. We had quite aggressive targets of 40% from underrepresented groups, and we've gone way beyond that. It's been a real success, and we're seeing a lot more diversity of instructors within Outward Bound, and obviously we can't hire everybody from the training academy, so that those people will now go out into the outdoor sector to work for other organizations as well.
Like you say, I hadn't actually thought of that as a barrier, but now that I think about it, in this camp that I work for, that is a thing that's starting to creep up more and more, is parents just being the barrier for the kid, where the kid wants to go and the parent is the one saying, why would you do that? That's so. And
certainly having information available, I think, recognizing that the value of what we do, we're doing this because it's a choice, and recognizing that, but having parent nights where we can show images and pictures, potentially get some alumni to talk to parents, one-on-one on what the experiences they had was. And I think another significant barrier is the thought that this isn't school. This is just a jolly in the woods. It's a holiday. And so why would we take our child out of school, which is proper education, academic education, and they're going to learn something? Why would we take them from that and go out to the woods to just have fun? And so really trying to articulate that, no, this is really valuable education, and not only education while we're out there, but when they come back to school, they'll be able to succeed in those academic studies even better because of this experience that they've had.
Yes. I keep distinguishing in my own vocabulary the difference between outdoor education and outdoor learning, just because I see outdoor education and the level that I taught it at anyways, it was skills. It was mostly like, here's how to light a fire, here's how to set up a tent, here's and you do that in the outdoors, and there's benefits to that for sure. But then outdoor learning is being in the outdoors, using the outdoors as either a text or a teacher or a mentor or whatever role you give it. And you can do things like English in the outdoors. You can teach science and all these different topics using the outdoors as a backdrop. It's been done that way from Indigenous folks for a long time. So it's not unfamiliar for a lot of cultural groups, but it like you say, it does sometimes come across that way, doesn't it, to some people, that it's just fun. It's just, people having fun, and they made connections.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, learning while having fun is the best way to learn. But it's not just that.
Yeah, no, not at all. I like that you brought that up. That to me is an issue that comes up with outdoor programs in general. With Indigenous groups, have you, obviously there's a bigger push, I would say nationwide, worldwide, to include Indigenous groups into programming, and I have seen on the website that is something that Outward Bound is including significantly. Maybe talk to that a little bit about what is the Yeah, maybe explain that to me. How are Indigenous groups involved with Outward Bound?
We've worked with Indigenous groups for ever since I've been involved, and way before that, since the
Oh,
80s. There's a lot of land camps, and there's a lot of knowledge from various First Nations on educating through the land. And so, who are we to come from, this colonial past from the UK? Who are we to come and suddenly extol our way of learning?
yeah.
And there's a lot of crossover, there's a lot of combined learning, but unless we have Indigenous instructors on a particular course, then it's not our role. It certainly can be offensive to say, okay, we're running a course that teaches Indigenous ways of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
What we
Mm-hmm.
have found is we're a charity. We get funding from the government, and the difficulty is that funding is quite fickle. Sometimes you get the funding, sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
And working with Indigenous communities needs to be a long-term relationship. It's not just like swooping in, educating, and then swooping back out. Like that's been done before with dire consequences. That's what we try and do, is to build a relationship up, to not say that our way of teaching is the only way. Try and work with communities, work with elders, and work with communities as well to try and get funding together as well. So we've just started a relationship with Lake LaCroix up by Quetico. It's a First Nations community where they came down to Temagami, a long way down to an area that we know as the first kind of course that we ran. But that's there's lots of problems with that. It's not their land as far as place-based education goes. It's not ideal to be just going to a different area just because we know it. For our second course, we went up to Lake LaCroix. A van load of instructors went up with our course director, and they had that conversation on the way up of, who are we to go up to this place and say, that we're really good educators and we're going to do this. And when they got there, they were so welcomed by the community, and particularly by the elders there, saying, look, we need you because we've lost this connection. There's a generational gap.
Oh, wow.
Through residential schools, through the 60s scoop, there's been, the intergenerational trauma that has happened through that. There's been this loss of knowledge of learning from the land. So that was really important for our instructors and for the rest of us when they came back and told us that, for us to hear. And so long as we're going into a community in good faith of not being, we are, everything we say is right and everything you say, oh, that's all old and should be ignored. We're never going to do that. We're going to learn together, develop courses together, and build that relationship together for the sake of the students. And now that we've been there and we can learn from them to get introduced to the lands around there, like the Quetico, I think it's provincial park around that area, is their homeland. That's their traditional territories. And so so being introduced to their ways of knowing on their land, and we come in with the aspects that we know. I mean, quite often that's a lot of the risk management practices around it, and what happens, what's the safety net if things don't go quite according to plan, and things like that.
Man, I really hope that there are educators, administrators, and people on every side of this table that listen to this podcast and go, oh, that it can be done. Because let me tell you, down here, Southern Alberta has long been a struggle. Now it's getting better. It's definitely improving. But here in Southern Alberta and in other places too, there's still that tension between between groups because of what you're saying. The come in, sweep in, do a show of trying to sound like you say the right words and you say it the right way, and then leave and then back to square one in many cases, without actually making any headway in terms of, like you say, any relationship building and long-term understandings. So yeah, I do hope that people hear that and go, oh, it is possible. It can happen. Yeah,
And we've definitely
yeah.
made missteps along the way.
Mm,
It's always a learning journey, and certainly, like we're at the start of this relationship with Lake LaCroix, and it's going well because we've had experiences before where we've made missteps, and with the best intentions, but it's not been the right way to go about things, and we've learned from that,
mm-hmm.
and we'll continue to learn as well.
Yeah, yeah. Lots we could say in that direction, but I want to keep this going along here. So, if a young person hears about Outward Bound and wants to get involved, you talked a little bit about the registration process, or not registration. You said something earlier
Through
about the
admissions.
admissions. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
What else do they need to know going into this? We talked about the cost early as a barrier. Is that something that can be subsidized, for example? That's maybe one question. We'll start with that. Could that be subsidized for a student?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we have funders. We have, whether that's foundations or individual givers or corporations. A large part of what we do is fundraising. We're also writing grants to the government. I mentioned the federal government grant for the training academy. There's an application process for that. So we're really proud that, depending on how successful we've been in any particular year, but over 60% of our participants have got some kind of funding in the last year. Some of that is 100%. Some of that might be a smaller percentage of their course. But
Okay.
yes, there's funding available for our courses. We've got a March break program happening in the Toronto Urban Centre today, and that's a 5-day program where it's $100 per participant. Because of 4/5 of that or more, we've managed to subsidize through our funders. So yeah, obviously the earlier the better. It's kind of that funding does whittle down pretty quickly. Some of it is restricted to certain groups. We're more and more trying to kind of free up that and unrestrict that funding, but sometimes a donor has a particular way that they want to donate and might fund a particular group.
Okay. What does it cost, for just out of curiosity? So, like, I'm going to do a 1-week expedition kind of trip with Outward Bound. What does that cost a person to sign up for something like that?
So, and it depends on the course. It depends on the region. It depends
Yeah.
whether it's in the urban center. I mean, in the urban center, it can be less than $100 for a day. But if we're doing a really remote trip, as I say, the example is the Missinarbi. In the cost, we've got to put in evacuation fees as well, because quite often, sometimes something happens on course, and in a remote area, it's got to be airlifted out, and so that can be up towards $450 a day.
Yeah.
But generally, for our what we call wilderness or our remote trips, it's between 250 and 350 per person per day.
Per day.
And so that subsidy really comes in handy, because not many people can afford that, to pay the full whack themselves.
Yeah. And your staff that are involved, their training is quite extensive as well, from what I understand. Yeah, I've ran into a couple of Outward Bound teachers and instructors along the way, just doing first aid courses with my own stuff. And yeah, when they talk about what their training is like, it's quite extensive.
One of the very first qualifications that we look at is a wilderness first responder. So that's an 80-hour first aid qualification, because if we're in remote areas, then there's dislocations that could be seen to by our staff. It's kind of one level down from paramedic, and there are certain protocols that our instructors can implement when in a remote environment. And what we usually say is a remote environment is 2 hours away, more than 2 hours away from definitive care. So that could be in the middle of Toronto if your elevator is stuck, because no one can get to you. So in that situation, you're allowed to implement your special conditions where you can put that training into use. Otherwise, you're on the phone to 911, and within 8 minutes, there's an ambulance down at the brickworks if anything happens.
Yeah.
So that's just the basic level. So
basic,
most of our
yeah,
staff
yeah.
would get the wilderness first responder. And then depending on the mode of transport, that might be certain sea kayaking
Right.
qualifications or ACMG, as you were saying with the
Yeah.
field leader that you have. But there's various levels of that for being in the mountains as well.
Yeah.
And we definitely look at the experience. So, for example, for canoeing in Ontario, we'd look at a trip log and how many extended trips has somebody run, whether that's personally or with a group. We rarely get, in fact, I would say, and in our urban programs, we might get somebody where, okay, this might be an assistant instructor where this is the first time they've been leading a group. But certainly in our wilderness, more remote operations, then these are people who want to make a career out of the outdoors.
Yeah.
It's not someone who's just doing this for the summer gig and then they're going to leave and get a proper job afterwards. It's like at the Outward Bound, it's usually they've come through a few different organizations, they've gained experience, and then they've come to us, and hopefully they'll stick around for a long time.
I'm so glad that we were able to make this connection because, like I say, I was held Outward Bound up as like, oh, they're like the standard of the best programming out there because I've just heard nothing but good things about them, and so getting to hear this from someone who is involved quite extensively with the programming really informs me. I hope it informs other people that didn't know anything about Outward Bound. I've been telling people, oh, I get to interview someone from Outward Bound, and they go, "What's Outward Bound?" And I'm like, What's Outward Bound? Like, yeah, it's the gold standard of youth camping, of youth programming, in my opinion.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, I think within the sector, we're pretty well known, but in Canada, it's improving. But our brand recognition, it's not huge. But I think outdoor education in general as well. There's not many organizations out there. There's not many people doing what we do. As I say, we're trying to increase perception, knowledge, trying to increase the value that people place on outdoor education, outdoor learning in general, and kind of the rising tide carries all boats kind of thing, and hopefully we can improve the sector as a whole.
Yeah, that's my you're very aligned with what I think of, what needs to happen with our society. Certainly when it comes to connections to the outdoors and connections to the natural world, it's so important to me right now. I just see, everything that Outward Bound stands for as achieving a lot of that. So I'll be promoting Outward Bound everywhere I go. It's something that I believe in very wholeheartedly. If you ever get the chance, you need to check out Faces Education. That's the camp that I work for.
Okay.
They're a similar program. I'm their videographer, so I do a lot of their videos and promotional stuff. But the basic concept there is very similar in Faces Education. Very not quite as extensive of expeditions, but there's like a first, second, and third year program for kids, and it starts with first year is rappelling and rock climbing, and we do some canoeing and a little bit of backpacking. But then the second year is a 40-kilometer journey, and then the third year are our leaders, our student leaders. Yeah, and it has a lot of parallels. As you're talking, I hear a lot of connections. So I know that my friends that are in that program are listening and going like, "Hey, I bet you they're thinking you should have asked him this question." And I'm like, "I'm sorry, I can't remember everything to ask." But yeah, I would say there's enough connections there to say that there's kindred spirits in Faces Education as Outward Bound. And yeah, now I get to tell people I know a whole lot more about Outward Bound. I'm looking forward to talking to more people about this.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rob, for being a part of this and donating your time to talk about this. I appreciate everything you've said here, and I hope it helped other people to understand what Outward Bound is all about.
Great. Yeah. Happy to help. Okay.
Yeah.